Well, we reflected more on the election outcome with Amy Mackinnon, a national security and intelligence reporter for the Washington-based Foreign Policy magazine, David Pratt, who's a foreign affairs correspondent, and Professor Murray Leith, who lectures in US politics. So a remarkable day in American politics. Let's start by asking each of you, why do you think he won? Amy?
I mean, I think there's going to be an extensive examination, particularly on the part of the Democrats, as to not only how Trump managed to win the election this week, but how the Republicans have managed to take the Senate and potentially even the House, although that's yet to be seen. And there's two sides to this coin, of course. There's a question of how, what are the sources of Trump's popularity, his remarkable popularity still after 8 years, but also, what did the Democrats go wrong? What went wrong for Kamala Harris's campaign? Because this was obviously a very unusual year for them, with Biden dropping out midway through the summer. And I think there's going to be real scrutiny on to what extent that hamstrung her campaign. The fact that she only had basically 3 months to make her pitch to the nation against a candidate who's had 8 years to make his pitch.
Yeah, Murray, what's your take?
Yeah, I very much agree, actually. The votes that we saw leak from the Democrats were from the suburbs. They were from Hispanics and young men and young black men. And those are the people that the Democrats need to vote for them if they're going to win the presidency and if they're going to win the Senate back. So that's, at the end of the day, why Donald Trump won.
Yeah, and he won convincingly, David.
He won convincingly, and I think, he was able to tap into, I think, a lot of the frustrations of the American electorate. The frustrations they have with old orthodoxies, old institutions, a certain kind of elitism or whatever. These are important factors, and Trump's very good at that, and his campaign proved very good at that as well. And I wouldn't rule that out. So in a sense, yeah, there's going to be a lot of analysis over the Democrats' defeat, but it is a resounding Republican win, and it's a win because enough Americans wanted him back. Let's be candid.
Yeah, absolutely. And Amy, now he's taken the Senate, as you said, he's likely to hold on to the House of Representatives, and he's got a friendly Supreme Court. That's a lot of power at Trump's disposal.
Absolutely. And of course, one of the things my colleagues and I are looking at is what does this mean for US foreign policy? What does this mean for the war in Ukraine? What does this mean for relations with China and for the war in the Middle East, given the precipice that conflict is on right now? Trump now is essentially unconstrained. And this is his second and presumably final term of the presidency. So he's not going to have to run for re-election. He doesn't have to kind of keep an eye necessarily on the ballot box. So he's really going to have, some extent unchecked authority to carry out his agenda.
Is that how you see unchecked authority, Murray?
Certainly the checks and balances that we'd normally rely on to keep the president sort of in line with certain goals aligned to his party are the Senate and the House and ultimately the court. And they're all very much in line with Donald Trump, and they're very much beholden to Donald Trump for this victory. So he's certainly going to have a long lead. It all depends, of course, on the reaction in a couple of years, because if he ignores the party and the Republicans take a hit, it's going to get dodgy at that point.
Does he have too much power, David?
Well, I don't know if he's too much power, but it's concerning for a lot of people. The concept or the idea of Trump unleashed, it is positively frightening in the eyes of many. There is an argument, of course, which I've heard a few, pundits and observers put forward today, that he's learned a lot since his last term in office, and that somehow we'll see a different kind of Trump. He's learned a few things. I'm not so sure that that we'll see the leopard changing his spots in that way. And I'm also concerned about the so-called guardrails. Who's he going to appoint in key positions there? Because he made a lot of enemies during that process. There were a lot of voices that kept him, reined him in, perhaps when he was going a bit overboard in the past. So it'll be very interesting to see who is around him in the new administration.
Yeah, who do you think is going to be around him, Amy?
Well, that's going to be the big parlor game now in Washington, is who's he going to appoint for those top cabinet posts. As David was saying, in the first administration, the people who he appointed they were known quantities. They had fairly extensive careers in foreign policy, and they did become the quote unquote adults in the room that did place some guardrails on Trump on some of his more unconventional approaches to foreign policy and national security. The speculation is that this time around, a lot of those people criticized Trump after they left office last time, They've written books about their time in the previous administration, that the priority this time is going to be on loyalty. So we may see more ideologically motivated people in this White House, and characters who haven't broken with him that will be familiar are things like people like Mike Pompeo, the former Secretary of State, Robert O'Brien, his former National Security Advisor. They're certainly just some of the big names that are swirling right now in Washington. It
will be interesting to see who he surrounds himself with. I mean, there's talk about Elon Musk, isn't there?
Elon Musk, RFK. I mean, the trouble is he falls out with people. He falls out with people because he doesn't like competition to be the big guy in the room. Mm-hmm. And Elon Musk, RFK, they like to be the big guy in the room. So the question is, how long before they have a public falling out?
Yeah, and what about his relationship with the UK? Because the Labour Party, of course, is a sister party with the Democrats. I mean, what's it going to be like going forward?
Well, much is always made about the special relationship, but it's going to be tense. There's no question about that. The simple fact is, that Keir Starmer's government and what they represent, in political terms, are far removed from what Trump represents in that way. There's also a little bit of niggle going on there. I mean, David Lammy's recent remarks, comparing him to Hitler, for example, might not be forgotten. I mean, they're meant to be big boys and girls in the room here. They're meant to be senior politicians that you can roll with the punches. But, Trump's not a guy who forgives and forgets very easily. So I think the relationship will be strained. And, there are obviously certain inflection points, in terms of foreign policy, tariffs being one of them, obviously relations with NATO, his response to Ukraine, things like that will all put that relationship under tremendous pressure.
Yeah, and we will talk about Ukraine in a bit more detail in just a second. But Murray, we heard Errol Moorcock from Republicans overseas saying Trump's a forgiving kind of guy and he loves Scotland, although we have to point out his mother is, of course, from Lewis, not Fife. Do you think it'll be business as usual?
Trump is a businessman. He likes to present himself as a successful businessman. He likes to do deals. And at the end of the day, if he can convince people that he's done a deal to the benefit of America, because he's an America First president, then it will be capable for the UK and America to come to some sort of arrangements. He's threatened to put tariffs on things. He has threatened to put tariffs on things that come out of Scotland, like whiskey, and of course, Harris tweed and things like that. So there are going to have to be negotiations. And you can't assume that he's going to be forgiving just because his mum was from Scotland.
Yeah, absolutely. Amy, what do you think about what will happen with Ukraine when Trump becomes president in January?
So Trump himself has said that he would look to end the war in 24 hours if elected and once he takes office in January. Now, of course, there's a lot of speculation that's really not possible. There is, what I'm hearing, though, from officials in Europe and in Ukraine as well, there is almost a cautious optimism to some extent. Because, of course, Trump has had a kind of relatively warm relationship with the Russian President Vladimir Putin during his first term. He has, we now know, kept in contact with him since he left the White House. So there was a lot of concern that the Trump main plan push a deal over the Ukrainians' head. But what I am also hearing is they're a little bit hopeful that his slightly erratic approach, his transactional approach to business to doing business deals, that he may want to try and get a great deal for his presidency to kind of seal his legacy, that may actually work in Ukraine's favor. So a little bit of optimism there, but also plenty to be worried about still in terms of ongoing military aid support.
That's so interesting that it might actually work out in Ukraine's favour, David.
Well, if anything is predictable about Donald Trump, it's his unpredictability. That's the only predictable thing about it. I can understand what Amy's saying there about that cautious optimism. There's a war weariness in Ukraine at the moment. It's incredibly beleaguered, And, some of the Ukrainians that I speak with, I go back and forward fairly regularly, you sense that war weariness, and they would welcome an end to the war. The question is, though, on what terms, given the blood and sacrifice that's been made in this war after Russia's invasion, what terms would they accept? And I think they would welcome the end of the war, but they would not want to be put under a certain kind of leverage that they felt was incredibly unfair and actually could provide tremendous problems, in a post-war situation for the Ukrainian government and for the region itself. So yes, on what terms? I think they would welcome it. I think there is cautious optimism.
And Murray, obviously his presidency has a huge impact on the world, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
You know, NATO, Taiwan, you were saying
Yes.
earlier. I mean, it will be felt across the globe.
Absolutely. America is, of course, considered the leader of the free world. He's considered the leading figure in the free world. But he's got a very specific view. As I say, America first. He believes that other countries haven't been pitching in the right amounts of money. He wants to see the members in NATO, for instance, increasing their military spending. It's going to have an impact. It's going to have an impact on the Five Eyes, the relationship with Australia and New Zealand and Canada. So there's no doubt he's rewritten the rule book again, and he'll probably rewrite it in a few months.
Yeah, Amy, far-reaching kind of consequences, not least in the Middle East, perhaps?
Of course, yeah. I mean, that's probably the most immediate thing that's going to be on Trump's desk when he takes office in January. And I mean, one of the things certainly watching for there is how does he handle the Iran portfolio? He took a very hawkish stance towards Iran during his first administration. Iran has only escalated its efforts in the region to destabilize Israel, but also, you know, U.S. presence there as well. So how is he going to handle that at a point in time when Iran is ever closer to potentially developing a nuclear weapon after Trump withdrew the U.S. from the Iran nuclear deal?
David?
Well, I think, you know, the Middle East is really something to watch here because, you know, his personal relationship with Benjamin Netanyahu is rather dysfunctional and quite strained. But, you know, it's interesting at the polls just before the presidential election, the polls in Israel, Israelis were massively in favour of a Trump win, you know. And as far as I'm concerned, I think Netanyahu will see this as a godsend, you know. Trump will probably double down on what Netanyahu wants in terms of the go-ahead in Gaza to complete the operation there. But as Amy, I think, rightly points out, Iran is what we really need to watch here because, you know, it would be perfect, I think, for Netanyahu to have Trump on side now. He has gone tough on Iran in the past. And I think one of the sad things about this as well is that with Iran having a new leader, a new president who was making overtures. Indeed, I think one of the previous occasions when Amy and I were on the programme here, that president was making overtures about talking and opening dialogue with the West. That could be put on the back burner now as a result of this.
We'll have to wait and see. But thank you all so much for joining us this evening.